A young woman with a troubled background suddenly controls $1 million property in New Hampshire. How? She had found a way of tempting the old man who'd owned the farm.
She bared her breasts. She exposed herself, sent photos of herself in very sensual positions, and she got a response. And that's how she ended up in her relationship with this man who eventually dies. And as a result of his death, now she has this house.
Soon after, young, vulnerable men down on their luck are seen coming and going. Neighbors fear that the farm is harboring a grim secret.
Coming down the wooden path, they saw a man stumbling and bleeding from the head. It was Michael Deloge, and he just said one word: Sheila.
Another young man, Kenneth Countie, was hooked on the older woman who had taken him in. His mother appealed for him to come home.
You don't want to be with a 47-year-old. There's ulterior motives there. No. And Kenny said, no, she loves me.
Kenneth Countie would become the second man killed at the hands of Sheila LaBarre. Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Sheila LaBarre as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? On a farm just outside Epping in New Hampshire, detectives answering a call related to the disappearance of this man come across a grisly sight.
So they went over and took a look inside. And what they found in there was a human bone. And on the knob of the bone was some human flesh. So now they are very worried about what has happened to Kenneth Countie.
Weeks earlier, Kenny's mother was convinced that her son had suffered harm at the hands of a woman called Sheila LaBarre. She feared he was possibly dead. She wanted a detective, a man called Cody, to check that Sheila LaBarre had not killed Kenny.
Detective Cody said, no, there was no reason to. And I said, is she going to kill my son? Because at that point, and that was in the very beginning, at that point, I knew something wasn't right. And he said, no, she's known to the Epping police and she would never do that.
Who was Sheila LaBarre? What had happened to Kenneth Countie? Why was there a human bone on a bonfire? Questions which would gradually be answered as police tried to uncover a killer's mistake. First, they had to find out about the characters in what appeared a disturbing and bizarre story. Sheila LaBarre had been known as Sheila Bailey during an unsettled childhood.
Sheila was born in a very small town in Alabama named Fort Payne. Sheila's childhood was very troubled. Her older sister says that Sheila was the subject of sexual abuse from her father and from other men.
Kenneth Countie had a troubled childhood too. When little more than a baby, his mother noticed he was behind others in his age range.
Kenny started having delayment in his academics. I brought him to the hospital. I brought him back and forth to the hospital to make sure that there was nothing wrong. At the time he was 1.5, I noticed that he started doing some clicking noises in front of the TV. He was taking petite seizures. So I brought him to the Children's Hospital, and they did a CAT scan and they did an MRI, and they found out that the left side of the brain never grew. And so that, added to Kenny's problems.
As he grew older, Kenny always appeared timid. Despite a tough start and his learning difficulties, he appeared to many to be a standard young man. Likeable too.
Kenny was a very trusting guy, but he was looking for his way in the world. He had a very loving family. His mother really took care of him. She understood that things were more difficult for Kenny than they were for other people.
Sheila LaBarre, born 20 years before Kenny, had suffered even before puberty. She had been sexualized by abusive men.
She grew up in a very abusive environment, was displayed as a sexual toy, was passed around to older grown men, friends of her father's, as a sexual object.
Sheila's father was often drunk and frequently violent. Her mother, Ruby, did what she could to protect her daughters, but it wasn't enough.
A teenage Sheila Bailey longed to escape this violent, small-town life. She dreamed of becoming an artist, a model, perhaps a singer, but in the end, she chose an easier route to financial independence. She found herself a man. But the abused woman would become a negligent stepmother.
Sheila was very young at the time. She was about, I think, 18 or 19 years old when she married John. He was a lineman for the county, and he was recently divorced and had a young daughter named Wendy.
Already she was showing signs of being a disturbed, damaged individual.
Sheila was not the most maternal person. Wendy told her father that when he would go to work, Sheila would take care of her by making her drink something. Brandy, maybe it's cough syrup, something that made her feel very sleepy. And it was also then that Sheila would put Wendy in the closet.
When John found out, he kicked Sheila out. The marriage lasted just 6 weeks.
At this time, Sheila had little trouble ensnaring the men that she'd set her sights on.
For many years, Sheila had a very curvy body, and she was very beautiful and was really able to maximize her sex appeal to get what she wanted.
Pretty soon after her first marriage ended, Sheila Bailey had claimed a second husband. It was to be another brief, unhappy marriage.
Sheila's second husband was a guy by the name of Ronnie Jennings. He worked at a restaurant in town, and Sheila fell hard for him. She basically wants to be loved. She wants to have a normal life. She thinks that Ronnie can provide that.
Sheila becomes Sheila Bailey Jennings. Friends of the happy couple might have thought that the stage was set for a long, happy marriage. Perhaps the bride could at last leave behind her traumatic childhood and her short-lived first marriage, settle down for good. It wasn't to be. The union between Sheila and Ronnie was soon to disintegrate, giving way to violence and infidelity.
Trauma in early life can have an impact later on, and it seems like Sheila was starting to abuse the people around her in the same ways that she had been abused herself.
She takes out her frustrations on Ronnie. She's abusive to him. And he decides that he doesn't want to be in the relationship anymore.
She took pills, sped off, and got into a pretty bad car accident. It looked like she was trying to kill herself.
Sheila survived the suicide attempt, but for a while was very unwell, comatose in fact. When she came round, she had an extraordinary tale to tell.
When she came back, she told everybody that she had died, gone to heaven, and God had sent her back as an avenging angel. And this was the persona that she carried with her throughout the rest of her life. And it sort of became the basis of her rationalization to kill.
Sheila told anyone who would listen that she was indeed an avenging angel sent by God to kill pedophiles, and that she saw herself as a protector of children. Was this truly what Sheila believed, or simply an excuse to commit unspeakable acts of violence against every man who had the misfortune to cross her path? One day, a jury would be asked that very question as they considered, had she killed Kenneth Countie? By the end of her second marriage, Sheila had committed no crimes that attracted the attention of the police. She was on no one's radar screen of investigation. In 1987, she began looking for husband number 3 and set her sights on a doctor, Wilfrid LaBarre.
He was a widower. He lived on a horse farm in rural New Hampshire. And Sheila found a Lonely Hearts ad in a newspaper that Dr. LaBarre had set up. He was very lonely after losing his wife and wanted companionship.
She just didn't write and say what she was looking for in a man, long romantic walks on a beach. She got right down to the point. She bared her breasts. She exposed herself, sent photos of herself in very sensual positions.
Well, he fell pretty hard for her. Sheila immediately got on a plane and began dating Wilfrid LaBarre. And she insinuated herself into his life almost immediately.
Sheila moved in with Wilfrid to become the mistress of a 100-acre horse farm in idyllic rural New Hampshire. It was the stuff of dreams, a far cry from the poverty and squalor of her Alabama childhood.
Sheila was now engaged in a relationship with somebody that could very well at least be the age of her father. And as a result, she was able, and she's this beautiful woman at the time, and she's able to manipulate and control because the older man is looking at Sheila. This is one of life's bonuses. How could somebody like himself get this beautiful young woman at the time? And so she used that. That was Sheila's web. She was able to suck him in and eventually use that to her advantage.
She moved to the farm. She started to take over his chiropractic business. She became the office manager and basically ran off all of the other employees that were, who could see through her. She separated Dr. LaBarre from his grown kids.
The couple never married, but Sheila took his surname. She became Sheila LaBarre. She's known around town as something completely different.
Sheila is a beautiful woman. She immediately gets attention in town for wearing tight clothes. In fact, people around town gave her a nickname. They called her Sheila the Peeler. They were always hoping that she would maybe flash a little this or show a little bit of that. And she got that reputation because, well, she had no problem coming to the door for delivery men wearing almost nothing.
In the quiet farming community of Epping, Sheila LaBarre became notorious.
Everybody in town knows that Sheila LaBarre is an unusual figure and that she is both treacherous and she is seductive.
Even the local police department, who over the following years would have many encounters with Sheila LaBarre, came to be wary of her provocative behavior.
When they would go to call, she would often be in very scantily dressed clothes and sometimes just drop it and bare it all to them with everything showing. And so officers knew when you get a call at Sheila the Peeler's house, you call for backup. Make sure somebody is there.
People at first might have worried that she was a troubled woman who needed help, not censure and gossip, but Sheila LaBarre appeared to be a woman who was very much in control. The sexual relationship between Sheila and Wilfrid was short-lived. Within a year, she effectively had ownership of her lover's property and his business.
When Sheila sucks him in through this relationship, she convinces him to give her power of attorney, to sign over property, and he does, because he doesn't want to lose her. He perhaps maybe doesn't feel worthy to have somebody at the time as beautiful as Sheila, but she's able to use what she believes is her beauty and charm to convince him to basically sign over everything.
She ended up spending 17 years with Wilfrid, but soon after she had taken over effective control of the farm and the business, she told him he was not to consider himself as her wife or partner. She would be free to live the life of a single woman. Why did Wilfrid LaBarre continue to let her control his life and his livelihood?
One of the questions that's hardest to answer is why did Dr. LaBarre stay with Sheila? Why did he keep her in his life when it seems like it would be so easy to just push her away? Somebody posed this question to Dr. LaBarre. Why keep Sheila around? She's making you miserable. She's taking your money. And all he could say was, she's got too much on me.
She ran his chiropractic business with a heavy hand, bullying patients into paying, scaring off employees that she didn't see eye to eye with. She also abused the doctor physically. A lieutenant with Epping Police would later testify that he'd been called to the farm many times over the years that Sheila lived there. On one occasion, he was responding to a call about a domestic disturbance and arrived to find Bill with deep scratches all over his face and neck.
Basically, she worked to isolate Dr. LaBarre and to take over his life and his property.
What hold did Sheila LaBarre have over the men that she abused? How did she make them stay with her, stop them lashing out at her in retaliation, or even pressing charges against her?
Sheila has an interesting habit of recording her telephone calls and her conversations.
Something Kenneth Countie's mother was to discover years later when Sheila played her recordings of conversations that she'd had with Kenny.
And it was very, very graphic. And I was dumbfounded. At that time, when I got that tape, I didn't want to see him anymore. I didn't want to talk to him. Because it was just so, it was horrible. It was horrible.
And part of a pattern of behavior. Catch a man, record him saying things which would incriminate him, and then control him.
She wanted to make sure that the people she was involved in a relationship, that she had utter, complete, 100% control, much like her father had complete control over her. So she isolated them, almost a brainwashing technique. You isolate someone and you can have vast influence over that person, so therefore she would have that ultimate control, much like a puppet master.
And all of this kept quiet down on the farm, her own world, one kept free from prying eyes. Even though they were no longer officially romantically involved, Sheila LaBarre continued to control the home, the business and the money of Dr. Wilfred LaBarre. She was so confident that he wouldn't kick her out, she started to bring home men.
Wayne Ennis was a handyman. He was a migrant farm worker from Jamaica. He was doing some work at the clinic.
It wasn't all smooth sailing. In 1995, Sheila filed a report with the Epping Police accusing Wayne Ennis of attacking her. She got a restraining order against Wayne, but despite that, the same year they got married.
Sheila gets married to Wayne Ennis and brings him back to the farm. And the three of them are now living on the farm together.
Sheila had kept Dr. LaBarre's last name. She was living on his farm, had control over his finances. But now she wanted him gone.
Wayne is very troubled one day when Sheila approaches him and says, we need to get rid of Dr. LaBarre. If he's gone, we will inherit this property. More specifically, Sheila will inherit this property. That's because Sheila has wrestled power of attorney from Dr. LaBarre. So she stands to inherit anything if something befalls the doctor. And now she's intimating to Wayne Ennis that he needs to do something to hasten Dr. LaBarre's death. Wayne is very troubled by this, so he goes to Dr. LaBarre and tells him what Sheila is planning. And he's fearful as well for his own safety. Dr. LaBarre then drove Wayne to a bus station, got him on a bus, and he got out of town, and Sheila never saw him again.
Wilfred LaBarre had voluntarily given up the running of his home and farm. Wayne Ennis had gone without reporting what she had asked him to do, so Sheila remained living on the farm, simply waiting for her next victim to come along.
James Brackett had a low IQ and his speech was slow. He was 10 years younger than Sheila and he was one of Dr. LaBarre's patients, but it didn't take long for Sheila to move him onto the farm.
Sheila is, coquettish, she's manipulative, she knows how to get what she wants out of a man, but she is also cruel. And that is one of the things that she demonstrates with James Brackett. She ends up being very abusive to him. She strikes him in the face with a scrubbing brush.
It was horrific abuse, and like all of the others, he was too afraid to leave.
James Brackett stayed on the farm almost 5 years. Midway through that time, Wilfred LaBarre died.
Dr. LaBarre died in 2000. Sheila told Dr. LaBarre's family that just one day he'd had a heart attack and died on the kitchen floor. And she insisted that he be cremated. It wasn't until later that people thought that this was suspicious. At the time, nobody thought much about Dr. LaBarre's death, that it was anything other than natural causes.
The autopsy showed that Wilfred had died of a massive heart attack, hypertension, arterial sclerosis, and high blood pressure. Little wonder, perhaps, given the abuse that he had suffered for over 20 years at Sheila's hands, but there was no apparent crime. His death marked a turning point in Sheila's treatment of men.
When Dr. LaBarre passed away, there was nobody there to keep her in check.
Sheila now owned the farm outright. She could control who came and went. There was no one to witness what she was doing, and there was no one to stop her or intervene. Her abuse of James Brackett continued and got worse.
She one time, chased him off the property and fired a shot over his head. She even chased him into a horse trailer that was in the barn, and she chased him with an axe and tried to chop her way through the trailer where he is huddled up inside. That's like a scene out of The Shining.
Sheila LaBarre's life was never normal, but her behavior after Wilfred's death was increasingly out of control. She smoked marijuana every day, sometimes took tranquilizers.
She got involved with sex chat lines, recording the conversations, and she would often force James to listen to them to share in her sadistic and unusual fantasies. She was violent towards him on a daily basis. On one occasion, she gouged his eye, leaving him bleeding, and on another occasion, she drove a car straight at him.
Men frequently came and went to Silver Leopard Farm, as Sheila had renamed it, or at least they arrived. They came as farmhands, or as Sheila's latest love interest. After a while, Sheila would tell anyone who'd listen that they just upped and left, that she had no idea where they'd gone. But had they? Some were never seen again. James Brackett made several attempts to leave, once even hiking through a blizzard to a local homeless shelter. Eventually, he escaped.
It wasn't until much later that he was essentially rescued from the farm by his relatives. And James Brackett considers himself lucky to be alive today.
The next young man to be ensnared by Sheila wouldn't be so lucky. He was called Michael Deloge.
Michael Deloge was a drifter. He came from Connecticut and wound up in a homeless shelter in New Hampshire.
She was able to suck those men in, almost like a spider in a spider web, bringing them into their cave where she eventually would kill them.
Michael was estranged from his ex-wife and young child. He had substance abuse problems, he was unemployed, he was desperate, alone, and vulnerable.
The prospect of staying in a homeless shelter or going with this woman to a farm where he could get a nice warm bed and a steady job and sex, well, that's a very easy decision to make.
Less than a year later, Michael disappeared. What had happened to him? His parents had become worried. What little contact they'd had dwindled to almost nothing. They were right to worry.
There were fears for Michael's safety and rumors of violence. On one occasion, she attacked him and almost severed his ear.
The neighbors describe an incident in the winter where, coming down the wooden path from the horse farm, they saw a man stumbling and bleeding from the head. He was Michael Deloge, and he just walked right past a neighbor and said one word: Sheila.
Terrified for his safety, Michael's mum, Donna, pleaded with her son to leave. Sheila was furious. What she did next would shed some light on a mystery: how she'd been able to keep beaten and abused men like Michael under her thumb for so long.
Sheila then sent Donna a video in which Michael accused Donna of allowing him to be sexually abused as a child. But in the video, his face is scratched and bruised.
Sheila has isolated Michael from his family, therefore he wouldn't be missed.
Not only is she isolating him from his family, but she's also poisoning the relationship and getting into his head until he believes it. He actually believes that he is a child molester because she has told him that so many times.
None of this was true. The men she had snared had not committed crimes, but making incriminating recordings had become part of Sheila's MO, the way she kept her victims compliant.
Sheila has an interesting habit of recording her telephone calls and her conversations. At one point, she had over 300 cassette tapes of things her on the telephone.
Was this what Wilfred LaBarre had meant all those years ago when he told a friend, "She has too much on me"? Either way, Wilfred had died of apparently natural causes. Another man had run as fast as he could away from the farm. Now Michael had gone. Men just didn't seem to last very long down on the farm with Sheila LaBarre. In 2005, Sheila LaBarre was alone again. She didn't like that, so she started looking for a new, younger man.
She was using telephone dating services where you would leave a message in somebody's voicemail box. And Sheila had a habit of screening the calls. And if the man sounded confident, if he sounded like he really had it all together, she would delete those messages. If the guy sounded meek, if he sounded like he might not be of high intelligence, if he sounded like he was somebody that she could manipulate, she kept those messages and contacted those guys.
Guys like Kenneth Countie. Kenneth was a young man looking for love, acceptance, independence. It was this longing that drew him to Sheila LaBarre, and within just a month of that first meeting, led him to his brutal death at the age of 24. His journey began with a need to be independent.
Kenny's mother, Carolyn, had always tried to do her best for him, and as he got older, that meant letting him go his own way and make his own decisions, even if she worried desperately about him.
He decided, well, I'm going to join the Army, I'm going to protect our country. And he said to me, can you take me down to Lowell? I'm going to sign up for the Army. And I couldn't believe he was going to do this. And I said, no, honey, you don't want to do this. And he said, no, Ma, I'm going to.
Kenny enlisted, and Carolyn prayed that at long last something would go right for her son. For a while, it seemed like his luck had changed.
I went up to a soldier, and I tapped him, and I said, do you know Kenneth Countie? I said, I'm looking for Kenneth Countie, I'm his mother. And he looked at me, he said, Ma, it's me. I didn't even recognize him. He had muscle, he was handsome. And he stood proud, and he did everything that a soldier did. I could see the life in his eyes.
But it wasn't to be. Kenny didn't graduate. It was to be the beginning of the end for his short, troubled life.
The day before his graduation, I got a phone call from Captain Pasquale saying that Kenny wasn't graduating. And the day of graduation, my son was directing traffic. And at that point, I looked in his eyes and they were dead. They were dead.
One of the most disappointing things in his life was that he couldn't graduate with his class and got drummed out of the Army. You know, it really could have changed his life for the better. Instead, he had to move back to Massachusetts and try to make a go of it.
Kenny was at his lowest ebb. He had become severely depressed. He had attempted suicide. He was at his most vulnerable. And for Sheila, he was ripe for the picking.
When Kenny spoke of his meeting with Sheila, Carolyn knew straight away something was wrong.
They met on a chat line. Come to find out, when I found out in court, it was a sex chat line.
Kenny meets Sheila at a fancy bar overlooking the ocean. And they have a few drinks, and they move from the bar to the back seat of Sheila's car, where they have sex. A few days later, Kenny goes to his roommate and says, I'm moving out. I'm moving to New Hampshire to live on this horse farm with my new girlfriend.
He was only 24, she was in her 40s, 47. She drank, she was loud, she was obnoxious. She went to his place in Wilmington, and she told the roommate that she just wanted him to come to her place for dinner and that she'd return him. So he didn't take any clothes, he didn't take anything. And once he got into the car, that was the end. He never returned.
Kenneth Countie's mother would never see him again. How long did it take Kenny to realize what a grievous error he had made in getting into that car? Carolyn was alarmed enough that she immediately contacted Epping police. A female officer took the call.
She sent the police to Sheila's house, and Sheila didn't like that because of the fact that I sent the police to her house for a well-being check.
When Kenny is not returning mom's phone calls, that's a red flag. Kenny's mom has to find out what is going on. Is he okay? So she contacted the police in Epping, New Hampshire. So the patrolmen go to Sheila's farm and they knock on the door and they say, we want to talk to Kenny. And she says he can't come to the door. He's taking a bath. They insist. And so Kenny comes to the door. He's wearing a towel, he's wet, but he seems to be okay.
Kenny might have been physically fine on that first visit by police, but Sheila was livid. How dare Carolyn report her? How dare local cops challenge her on her own property? She was not going to take the intrusion lying down.
Kenny has moved to Sheila's farm, and Sheila is doing the same pattern as she had for all the other men, and that starts with cutting him off from her family.
Sheila's response to this, when Kenny had been on the farm just a couple days, was to make a shocking tape which she played on the phone for his mother.
She had him saying all these horrible things about me, that I sexually molested him when he was a baby, that I continued to do that when I went to England.
Once again, as with Michael Deloge, James Brackett and perhaps Wilfrid LaBarre, Sheila was using accusations of paedophilia to control her victims and isolate them from their families.
And it was very, very graphic. I think at that time it was for me to back off. Oh, definitely, because I sent the police to her house.
Carolyn was devastated, but if Sheila had hoped that she would back off, she was mistaken. Carolyn continued trying to call her son at the farm. When she couldn't get hold of him, she repeatedly contacted local police, begging them to check on him, to remove him from the farm, anything to protect him from this scheming woman. That's the way she saw it. On one occasion, local police denied outright that Sheila was dangerous.
He told me that she would take young men to her farm and they'd work the farm, and then she'd call the police department to say that they left. Well, I found that pretty bizarre, and I said, well, how do you know they left? How do you know she didn't hurt them? She could have killed them. Did she kill them? And they started laughing. He said, no, that's not Sheila's MO.
There's nothing stronger in life often than a mother's love. And because of a mother's love for her child and refusing to accept the answers that were being given to her. She pushed and pushed and pushed and stayed in touch with the police and just wasn't satisfied with the answers she was hearing.
When the police had first visited Kenny a few days after arriving at Sheila's farm, he seemed to be doing fine. But the next time he was seen in public, his mental and physical well-being had dramatically deteriorated.
Weeks later, when these officers see Kenny at the Walmart, Sheila took Kenny to Walmart and he was unable to walk through the aisles himself. She was pushing him in a wheelchair. His face was a weird color and he had bruises and cuts and burns.
His face was all cut up. His hands were all cut up. One of them was immobile. His head was down. He was ashen in color. He was all cut up, and he was in a wheelchair, and he couldn't walk.
What had happened to Kenneth Countie, and what did Sheila LaBarre have planned for him next? Her sinister shopping list that day should perhaps have given officers who spoke to her a clue. She certainly hadn't popped in for a few groceries.
Sheila was there shopping with Kenny, and the thing that she was buying were diesel fuel cans. And she made Kenny hold these fuel cans as she shopped.
They escorted her, and they're laughing. And she told, when they asked Kenny if he was all right, his head was hanging, he was drooling, and she told him to shut the F up. At that point, the police should have taken him. They didn't. They watched her take him to the car and lift him from the wheelchair into the car.
When Epping police told Carolyn about the sighting of Kenny, she was beside herself with fear. Once again, she pleaded with them to do something to save her son.
And I said, and you let her take him, knowing that I was looking for him, seeing the way he looked. I said, you let Sheila take my son, she's going to kill him. And he said, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. And she killed him 2 days later.
On March 23, 2006, Sheila LaBarre called the local police chief and told him that Kenny had left her. Over the phone, she played cops an audio recording of Kenny confessing to a long list of truly disturbing crimes.
And Sheila says, he left, and I can prove it, and I can tell you why he left. And so she plays over the telephone a tape recording that she made of Kenny. And what the officer heard was Sheila berating Kenny and getting him to confess that he was a child molester and that he had abused kids. On the tape, the officer could hear Kenny becoming weaker. And at one point, he heard Kenny vomit. And then he thought he heard Kenny faint because Sheila was saying, "Get up, you can't fake fainting."
Kenny was clearly really unwell when the recording was made. She claimed to have identified a dangerous pedophile and was forcing Kenny to confess to things that he'd never done.
Panic-stricken, Carolyn filed another missing persons report. But it was too late. When police the next day visited Sheila's place, they found strong evidence that Kenny hadn't simply walked away from the farm. Carolyn's worst nightmare appeared to have come true.
The detectives go back to the property and they see a fire, and it's personal items being burned, it's clothing, it's other items, but one thing that stands out to them is they believe that they see bones.
And they appeared to be human bones, specifically a toe. It was the key mistake in the timeline of the case against Sheila LaBarre.
They also found Kenny's sneakers lying around. Would he really have left barefoot?
The evidence was everywhere that something truly horrific had happened at the farm, but Sheila LaBarre showed no fear of being caught. She'd made no attempt to hide what she was doing. She berated police for daring to trespass on her land, brazenly joked about the horrifying finds that they'd made.
When asked what was burning in the barrel, she said it could be a rabbit or it could be a pedophile. When asked about a plastic bag filled with soot and debris, she laughed and said that was Kenneth.
When police returned with a warrant to search the property, they made even more horrifying finds. There was no doubt multiple acts of extreme violence had been committed.
They spray what's called LCV. It's a type of spray that it's with dark lights, and when you spray this, if it glows purple and a purple tone to it, it indicates the presence of blood, that perhaps that was blood. And when the detectives used this technique inside of Sheila's home, the whole inside, this one room, lit up purple. An indication that there was an extremely large amount of violence that took place inside that room.
Detectives also finally had an answer to the fate of Michael Deloge, who disappeared without a trace a year before.
One of the things they did was they flushed the septic tank. What they found in the septic tank when they searched it was Michael Deloge's driver's license.
But another piece of evidence unearthed at the farm remains a mystery to this day.
We don't know how many victims that are out there that Sheila actually was able to suck into her web. What still haunts the detectives is a toe, a single toe. A single toe was found on that property. That toe is unidentified.
One of the things later about the human toes was that they didn't belong to Kenny, and they didn't belong to Michael Deloge. So who is it?
Detectives now knew that terrible things had happened at the isolated horse farm in rural New Hampshire, and Kenneth Countie knew that her efforts to save her eldest son had been in vain.
That was my son. That was my son. Could have been stopped.
Finally, one mistake having been uncovered and other evidence now plentiful, a warrant was issued for Sheila LaBarre's arrest. But still, she thought she was above the law. From under the noses of local police, she went on the run.
Sheila took $85,000 with her and hitched a ride with a man called Steve Martello.
She wanted to hitchhike her way down to Boston. So Steve picks her up in his car, and after having some breakfast together, they continue down to Boston. And she gets a hotel room with him, and the two of them have sex, and then he leaves. And it isn't until he sees the news that Sheila is a wanted woman that he realizes who he had picked up.
She seduced him, and he let her hole up in his apartment for a couple days.
He realizes who he has let into his home, and he calls the police and essentially sets up her capture.
Sheila LaBarre was behind bars at last. When the case went to trial, Sheila finally admitted killing Kenneth Countie and Michael Deloge, but asked for clemency on the grounds of insanity.
She changed her story several times about how her victims had died. She kept going back again and again to that same story that she was an avenging angel sent to kill pedophiles, and that all of the men in her life were child molesters.
The jury rejected Sheila's plea. There was too much evidence of calculation, control, manipulation, not only of her victims, but of everybody that she came into contact with.
And the burden is on the defense, in this case Sheila, that they didn't know what they did was wrong. Why this story would unravel with Sheila is because of the amount of planning that went into her murders and the cover-up. Somebody who's crazy isn't going to try to burn evidence. Somebody who's crazy isn't going to try to cover up the amount of blood that was inside the house. Somebody who is crazy isn't going to methodically pick the most vulnerable of victims.
Sheila LaBarre is a disturbed person, but she knew what she was doing when she killed those men and when she hid the evidence.
Michael Deloge's mother was in court to see LaBarre found guilty, sentenced to 2 life tariffs without parole. Kenneth Countie was there too, the mother who never gave up. She wasn't able to save her son, but she did ensure that his killer was brought to justice for her evil crimes.
I promised Kenny that I'd fight for him, because nobody did. That he wouldn't be forgotten. When Sheila murdered him, she burnt everything in the pit. I never had a body. I never had closure. I never had anything. So he could walk through that door now, and I'd be expecting him. And I promised him his name would not be in vain. She wasn't used to being confronted by anybody. Sheila had the run of Epping. What Sheila said went. She'd be able to say anything to the police. They didn't want to deal with her, so they just backed down.
Sheila thought that she was invincible. She thought that she could do what she wanted and get away with it, and she never thought that anyone would have the guts to confront her.
Sheila LaBarre was so brash that she didn't cover her tracks, as she left a human bone sticking out of a burning barrel in her yard. It gave the police the opportunity they'd been waiting for to finally investigate her crimes. That was the mistake made by a killer, Sheila LaBarre.